Worship team this morning for getting us started. Thank you guys so much. There's not really a better way to get started to get into God's word together than through worship. So thank you. Hey, this morning, I've got a memory verse for you, okay? Maybe you haven't had a memory verse since you grew up. If you grew up going to church and Sunday school, maybe you had memory verses then. But I've got a memory verse for you. It's a hard one, so you might want to write it down. I don't know if you can remember it. Here it is, John 11:35. Then Jesus wept. That's a tough one, right? That's a hard one. We're going to memorize this, okay? So I encourage you to do so. Let's say it together. Ready? Then Jesus wept. Good job. I'm so proud of you guys. If you memorize this, come back next week and say, hey, I memorized it. Here it is. Got the reference, got everything. I'll give you a sticker, okay? So it's just like Sunday school. It's just like growing up. Some of you think that's a joke, but if you do it next week, I actually will. We have been in this series, According to His Best Friend. This is the 5th week. This morning is the 5th week, and this is taking us up to Easter. It's actually going to be the week after Easter as well. So hopefully you've enjoyed this series so far as we've been walking through the story of the life of Jesus from the perspective of his best friend, John. So as a lot of us know, Jesus had 12 disciples that are named. He probably actually had a lot more, but his closest disciple for the 3 years of his public ministry was John. And so we're looking at the stories of Jesus from the perspective, through the lens of his best friend. And today we're going to be in John chapter 11, where that verse comes from that you've probably heard before, then Jesus wept. We're going to be looking at that verse and what it really means, the full context of why Jesus weeps. But we're going to be in John chapter 11, starting in verse 1. I'm just going to jump in because we've got a lot of story this morning. So stick with me. Here we go. Verse 1. A man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters Mary and Martha. So the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, Lord, your dear friend is very sick. Now, a lot of us, not all of us, but a lot of us already know what's about to go down in this story. Right? You see the name Lazarus, and a lot of us are already drawing connections to maybe a message you've heard, or you just know the story in the Bible of what happens with Lazarus here in John chapter 11. I know I've heard it many times, but I have never heard this story taught, preached, or even read it for myself in the full context of what is happening in this story. Never. And so I'm hoping this morning, if you stick with me for a couple minutes, we're going to walk through a little bit of the context of why John is writing this, but the payoff is going to be so worth it because we're going to see a fuller picture of what is happening here with the Lazarus story. It is so much more than meets the eye. It is so much more than Jesus' friend dying and Jesus raises him from the dead, okay? So stick with me, a little bit of context. Historians believe, I already lost half the room because I said the word historians, but stick with me, okay? Historians actually hold that John wrote the Gospel of John in 70 AD. Let me tell you why that matters. In 70 AD, something big happened in the world at that time. The temple was destroyed for the second time. In Jerusalem, there was a temple, and the Jewish people would go to this temple, and that's where they worship, and they'd have their celebrations and their Passover meals and these kinds of things. And in 70 AD, that temple was destroyed. And every time the temple was destroyed, the Jewish people would kind of just fall apart. They would just completely just go into a scramble of we don't know what to do. We don't know where to go to worship God. We don't know how we're going to have faith anymore because our temple's gone. And so 70 AD, years after Jesus has already died on the cross and rose again and all the things that Jesus did, the temple's destroyed, and the Jewish people who should know God and should definitely believe in Jesus are freaking out because their temple's destroyed and they don't have a place to worship God and they don't know what to do. And so John is writing to that situation. John is addressing the Jewish people head on. He's saying, look, you guys of all people should know that Jesus was really the Messiah, and you're still missing it. So I'm going to write you this book to prove to you once and for all that Jesus is really the Son of God. So that's the context that John is writing to. And his structure for how he does it is he sets his book up, the entire Gospel of John, and there's about 7 really big moments. And in between those big moments, there's teachings, there's stories of Jesus, but there's 7 really, really big moments. We've looked at a lot of them in this series so far. And each moment actually became more and more undeniable. So the Jewish people reading this book when their temple was destroyed and John was trying to prove to them that Jesus was who he said he was, as they came to each of these moments, they had less and less reason to not believe. That's the structure of the Gospel of John. It's really, really, really cool. And so John writes this book to the Jewish people. If you read Gospel of John cover to cover this morning, you would see the words, the Jews, countless times. Because that is who John is addressing. People that should know God, but they missed out on on who Jesus was. And now they're actually against Jesus actively. And John is writing to them to say, hey, God has come. Jesus has died for your sins. And you can believe in him, and through him, you can meet with God anywhere. So that's the context of the story. And in each of as you go through the book of John, you'll actually watch, not only does Jesus' life get more and more undeniable, but the hostility towards Jesus from the Jewish people gets more and more intense. Check this out. I put it all on the screen at the same time. John 2:18. This is early on. So the Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? So they're questioning, but they're kind of just wondering who Jesus is. 3 chapters later, John 5, this is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. That took a turn, right? John 7, 2 chapters later, after this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. It's getting more intense. You can see it mapped out in the book of John. And then John 10:31, right before the story we're about to read, the Jews picked up stones again to stone him. So when you map it out like this, chapter to chapter, you actually see that they are more and more actively against what Jesus is doing here. And now we're in John chapter 11, nearing the end of Jesus' life. And the hostility is at an all-time high. And now knowing all of that, and knowing that John was writing to the people that were actively against Jesus, we're going to pick up and keep reading this story of Lazarus that a lot of us know, but maybe we don't see the full picture. So John 11, we're going to continue in verse 4. But when Jesus heard about it, he said, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. So although Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. And finally, he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. I don't know about you. I've read this story countless times, and I have missed that in the very beginning of Jesus' response, he already tells them this is not going to end with Lazarus dying. Right off the bat. He says he's not going to stay dead, and the reason for this happening is so that you will actually believe in me once and for all. He just tells them straight up, this is what's happening, and they miss it. Verse 8, but his disciples objected. Rabbi, they said, only a few days ago the people in Judea were trying to stone you. Are you going there again? So because we know the context, because we know that the Jewish people were actively more and more against Jesus, then this makes a lot of sense. They're pushing back and saying, Jesus, do you really want to go back there? Do you remember a couple days ago when those very people were waiting to stone us? And now we're going to go back to the place, the scene of the crime, if you will? They're very logically saying this doesn't make sense. But Jesus has already declared and he's going to continue to say that something bigger is happening here. That God has something behind the scenes going on. Verse 9, Jesus replied, there are 12 hours of daylight every day. And during the day, people can walk safely. They can see because they have the light of this world. But at night, there is danger of stumbling because they have no light. So this is kind of an interesting response, right? The disciples are like, are we really going back there? And Jesus responds by telling them how many hours of sunlight there are, right? It's kind of weird. What Jesus is saying here is those hours of daylight are the time that they have him with them, right? The sun, the light of the world, right? He says, you have me here with you right now. Therefore, there's an urgency, there's an importance. We've got to move, we've got to do stuff because darkness is coming. There's going to be a time when I die and I'm not with you physically anymore. He's saying, so we've got to go. There's an urgency in what Jesus is saying here. Verse 11, then he said, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I will go and wake him up. This is the second time in this story already that Jesus has told them Lazarus is not going to stay dead. Verse 12, the disciples said, Lord, if he is sleeping, he will soon get better. They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was simply sleeping, but Jesus meant Lazarus had died. Thanks, John. Thanks for that detail. We were confused. Verse 14, so he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there. For now, you will really believe. Come, let's go see him. This is the third time already in this story, 3 times that Jesus has told the disciples, Lazarus is not going to stay dead. I've never seen this before as I've read this story so many times in my life. 3 times already Jesus is telling them, Lazarus is not going to stay dead. And then in verse 15, look at what he says. For your sake, it's actually better I wasn't there. What he's saying is if I was there, I could have just healed him from his sickness, no big deal, I've done it before, let's move on. But the fact that I wasn't there is actually going to push you into actually believing in me. This is powerful. And Jesus knows in this moment, the people in Judea are waiting to stone him. They are actively against him. And he knows that if he demonstrates power over death, not only are his followers going to believe in him more than they ever have, but the people against him are going to come harder after him than they ever have. So Jesus is standing in the middle of this tension. Jesus knows if I do this, both sides of this are going to come down on me. At this point in John's gospel, as he logically makes Jesus' case more and more undeniable, Jesus has not publicly demonstrated power over death yet. So John is trying to paint this picture that if this happens, things are going to get more intense than ever before, which is why in verse 16, Thomas said to his fellow disciples, let's go too and die with Jesus. Right? If you don't know the context, if you don't know what's going on here in the bigger picture, then Thomas maybe just seems a little bit dramatic, right? But the fact that we know what they're stepping into, we know what they're going back to, then this makes a lot of sense because Thomas is saying, hey, we're going to ride with you, Jesus, but we know there's a high chance that we're going to die too. We're going back to where people are actively waiting to kill you and kill your followers. And so understanding the bigger picture of this story, we actually can understand that going to raise Lazarus is actually a suicide mission. Going back to Judea, going back to where these people are waiting for Jesus, going back to where the Jewish people are like, come on, come back, we're going to kill you next time you come. The fact that Jesus is going to go raise Lazarus is actually more dangerous than a lot of us have heard before. So I'm going to summarize the next couple verses because we just don't have enough time. But Jesus finally arrives in Bethany, and he's told that Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. And John makes note of the fact that there's actually a bunch of people here now. In 4 days, people from all the surrounding villages have come to comfort Mary and Martha in their loss. And John wants us to make note of the fact that there is a lot of people here. There's a crowd here with Mary and Martha. So Jesus comes to this town, and he actually stays on the outside of the village because he doesn't want attention. So he's waiting on the outside of the town because of how many people have gathered with Mary and Martha. And then Martha decides to come see Jesus for herself. Verse 21, Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. Have you ever prayed something like that or felt something like that? God, if you had only done this, then this wouldn't have happened. She says, but even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. 4 times. 4th time, Jesus has told them, Lazarus is not staying dead. There is more to the story here. Verse 24, yes, Martha said, he will rise when everyone rises at the last day. Maybe this is just how I picture it, but I kind of picture Martha like rolling her eyes, like, yeah, I get it, Jesus, I know that everybody's going to rise again, I get it. Verse 25, Jesus told her, this is so good. Jesus told her, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never, ever die. Do you believe this, Martha? I believe Jesus is asking us that same question. Do you believe this personally? Do you believe this? Jesus says, I'm the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me and lives in me will live even after dying. This is the truth, the powerhouse truth of this message this morning. That Jesus declared that he was the resurrection and the life. And we know, because we're 2,000 years removed from this story, we know that he's about to go to the cross and rise again and prove that he meant this, right? But she says, yes, Lord, in verse 27, I've always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God. She says, I know, I've got the head knowledge, I know the stories, yes, I've always believed that. And then what happens is Martha goes home and she gets her sister Mary. See, Mary would not come out to see Jesus because she's dealing with this grief of the loss of her brother, and she doesn't want to see Jesus face to face because she's like, Jesus, you could have solved this problem. So Martha goes back and she's like, you got to go see him. Verse 32, when Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. There's that statement again. And in the verse before, John actually wants us to make note of the fact that the crowd went with her. The crowd sees her leave her home and go out of the village, and they're like, what's going on? So they all kind of follow. So now Mary shows up and falls at Jesus' feet, and she says this, and there's a crowd that's watching him kind of be put into this tight spot. And don't you think that that was a bit of a slap in the face to Jesus? Two people now, people that loved him and were close to him, said, God, Jesus, if you had only done this. What they're saying is, if your timing was like my timing, this would be a lot better. If you had done this the way that I would choose to do this, then I wouldn't be feeling sad, and I wouldn't be feeling emotional, and I wouldn't be confused. So Jesus, if you had only. And watch Jesus' response. Never noticed this in my life. Verse 33. When Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. Never noticed that in my life. Jesus has said 4 times already in this story that Lazarus is not going to stay dead. The people closest to him are telling him, Jesus, if you had only done this, if you had only done this. And Jesus is standing there, and what's inside of him? Anger. Jesus is upset. It says deeply troubled. The same word that's used there is the same word that's used when Jesus is in the garden the night before the cross, sweating drops of blood, begging God to take the cross away from him. And that same word is used in this moment when he's standing here going, guys, I've got it figured out. And so all of this, the tension, going back to Judea where the people were waiting for him, the emotions of knowing what's going to happen if he goes through with this. Not only are people going to believe in him more than ever before, but people are going to come after him harder than ever before. All of this is on Jesus' shoulders. And then we have our memory verse in 35. Then Jesus wept. Here's how I've always heard it taught. Jesus shows up to the grave, sees Mary and Martha and his friends crying. He's already said that he's going to heal Lazarus, but then he shows up to the grave, sees them crying, and then says, oh no, Lazarus is dead, I'm so sad. Doesn't really fit the context, does it? 4 times already, Jesus has told them, God's got this. And Jesus is standing in this moment, knowing what's going to happen if he goes through with this, feeling deeply troubled, feeling anger, feeling emotional, and he weeps. From this place of, I'm overwhelmed. The weight of the world is hanging on this decision that I'm about to make. That's where Jesus is. In our English Bibles, this is the shortest verse. And it is powerful to picture the Son of God weeping. But have we ever truly wondered why? Have we ever wrestled with why? And hopefully already this morning, as we're seeing the bigger picture of everything that's going on here and this decision that Jesus is staring in the face, do I heal him, do I not? And Jesus is in this moment. Hopefully we're beginning to see it's more than just Jesus being sad. In verse 36, the people, remember there's a crowd there, they take a stab at it. The people who were standing nearby said, see how much he loved him. But some said, this man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying? Why did Jesus weep? I believe it's more than one thing. I have 4. I'm sure there's many more things that Jesus is wrestling with, but I have 4. Jesus wept, yes, point 1, because of compassion for suffering. We believe in a fully human, fully God Jesus, right? We believe that he felt the weight of this moment. He saw the suffering and the grief of his friends. We do believe that. But that's not it. I also believe that there's a grievance of sin here. Jesus knows that death is the result of sin. Jesus knows that without the resurrection and the life, death is the end result. And death breaks God's heart. So Jesus standing here, knowing that not only is this moment going to bring people against him, but he's about to go to the cross and do this for all of the world, and that's going to bring people against him. He's feeling the grievance of sin. Not only that, but it's kind of similar. He's in the cost of redemption. He's seeing, hey, in over a week. I don't know if you know that. This Lazarus story is just a little over a week from Easter. And Jesus is standing here going, I'm about to be the one in the grave. I'm about to take the sins of the world on me for the cost of redemption. My friend's in the grave right now, but it's about to be me. And he's feeling the weight of that. And he knows, yet again, that this moment is the cause of his death. He knows that because of the tension, because of the hostility, because of the Jews being against him, because of the eyes on him, what's he going to do in this moment? He knows if he goes through with this out of compassion, out of love, he knows it's going to cause him to die. Verse 38, Jesus was still angry as he arrived at the tomb. A cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. Roll the stone aside, Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, Lord, he has been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible. Verse 40, Jesus responded, didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? That's the 5th time he's told them something bigger is happening here. Verse 41, so they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of all these people standing here, so they will believe you sent me. Yet again, he's showing us the reason why this is happening, so that others will believe that God sent him. Verse 43, then Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told them, unwrap him and let him go. That's a powerful story. And we know it, and we've heard it. Jesus comes through, and it's a breakthrough moment of Lazarus walking out of the grave. Can you imagine being in that moment and the emotions, right? Have you ever wondered what happens next? Because the next verse, no joke, the next verse, John writes this. The heading is the plot to kill Jesus. The next verse, verse 45. Many of the people who were with Mary believed in Jesus when they saw this happen, but some went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the leading priests and Pharisees called the high council together. What are we going to do? They asked each other. This man certainly performs many miraculous signs, and if we allow him to go on like this, soon everyone will believe in him. And then the Roman army will come and destroy both our temple and our nation. When we see the full picture and the context and the tension that John is writing this story in and Jesus performed this miracle in, then we actually see that giving Lazarus life confirmed Jesus' death. A verse later, the Roman officials and the leading priests are already planning, all right, I know this guy's been a threat for a while. He's been doing stuff that's been bothering us, and we don't really approve of his teachings and what he's been doing, but now that he's done this, we've got to move him to the top of the hit list. Now that he's done this, we need to throw everything we have at this man because he cannot stay alive anymore. Because if this happens, then everybody's going to believe in him. So of course, Jesus wept. Of course, Jesus wept. He saw this full picture. He knew what was waiting on the other side of him bringing Lazarus back to life. So of course, feeling the weight and the tension and the overwhelming emotions that he was feeling, of course he weeps. Because he knows by bringing Lazarus back to life, he sealed his death. He knows that the cross is closer than it's ever been for him. Wouldn't you weep too in that moment? So Jesus weeps. And have you ever asked yourself the question too of what did Lazarus do after this? See, I've read this story, been taught this story so many times, and as I was writing this week, I wrote pretty much everything you've heard so far. And then I was sitting there, and in the back of my mind, I go, wait, what did Lazarus do after? Do we know? Where did he go from here? Because I actually didn't know. And so I started researching and started looking and started trying to figure out, what did Lazarus do after this? Because we have to have some account of this man who was brought back to life after 4 days. Where did he go? What did he do? And in John 12, 9 through 11, we actually see, look at this. When all the people heard of Jesus' arrival, they flocked to see him and also to see Lazarus, the man Jesus had raised from the dead. Then the leading priests decided to kill Lazarus too. For it was because of him that many of the people had deserted them and believed in Jesus. Are you kidding me this morning? The leading priests now not only have Jesus on the top of their hit list, but maybe second is this guy named Lazarus. He just wouldn't shut up about Jesus. So they're like, we've got to do something about him too. Start putting those plans in place because we cannot have him around anymore. Do you think he could help it? Do you think the day after he is raised from the dead and he's back to life on earth, he wakes up and he has this moment of like, should I go tell people about it or not? I mean, like, I know Jesus did this amazing thing. I know I came face to face with the resurrection and the life, and he changed my life, obviously, but should I go do something about it? Nah, it's fine. I'm not really a good speaker, and I don't really have the right personality and the right skill set. My job isn't really in that world, so I just won't do it. Do you think he could help it? I don't think so. I think Lazarus came face to face with the resurrection and the life, and his only option was to go tell people about it. I think Lazarus was so marked by the new identity of the man raised from the dead that he couldn't help but say, no matter what happens to me on the other side of this, no matter what is waiting for me, no matter who says what, no matter the pain, no matter the sacrifice, I can't help but go tell other people about Jesus. Church, aren't we marked by that same sacrifice? Aren't you and I sitting in this room, if we believed in what Jesus did on the cross, aren't you and I men or women that have been raised from the dead too? Why don't we act like it? Why are we so casual about it? A little over a week after this story, Jesus is going to go to the cross and die for the sins of the world so that anyone who believes in him will have eternal life. Anybody who believes in him will be brought back from the dead. And yet you and I, the lives that we live, the way that we go about our faith in the day-to-day outside of Sunday, it doesn't really reflect that, does it? It's just another thing that we do. It's just a chore, something to check off. But if you're in this room right now, and you have, as the psalm says, tasted and seen God for yourself, you have no other option but to talk about it. If you're in this room right now and you have been resurrected by Jesus, a part of your life has been brought back to life because of him on the cross, then you have no other option but to say, this is the only thing that matters and nothing more matters than this. What's dead in your life this morning? Where do you feel like you need the resurrection and the life to step in? Where do you need Jesus' resurrection power in your life? Because if you look back at that verse when Jesus said that he's the resurrection and the life, he says, believe in me and live in me. So he says, yes, you can believe in me and eternally you will be resurrected. That's a moment of belief, of trusting in me. But he also says you'll live in me. You will walk in the promise of the resurrection and the life. You will walk in the identity that you're now a son or a daughter of God who has been brought out of the grave. Church, what in our lives is dead? Is it a relationship? Is it a habit? Is it a routine? Is it a mindset? Is it a perspective? What has died in our lives? Because if we're just casual about this, if we're just passive about this, is it possible that we've never come face to face with the resurrection and the life for ourselves? Is it possible that we know the stories, we know the truth, we know the reasons, we know all the things, but we've never felt and walked in the promise for ourselves? Could that be the reality? We need to bring our dead things to Jesus. God, I know that you've brought me back to life for eternity, and I'm going to live in eternity with you in heaven. That's amazing. But God, I need your resurrection power right now, today, on this Tuesday morning when I don't feel like getting out of bed. We need to walk in the promise that we serve a God who brings dead things back to life, and we bring things to him. It might not look how we think it's going to look. Remember, they said, Jesus, if you had only done this, right? It might not be on our timeline. It might not be at our pace. It might not be what we think or how we think it. But the promise stands true that we serve a God who is the resurrection and the life. And if you believe in him and live in him, he wants to bring things back to life. It's in his nature. It's in his power. It's who he is as the God that we serve. He says, bring it all to me. Not just your Sundays, bring everything to me. Ugly and broken and dead, bring it all to my feet and watch what I'm going to do with it. Would you stand with me as we close in prayer this morning? Father, this morning, we come before you, the God who is the resurrection and the life. There's so much power in that statement because that means it's your identity, it's your nature. You can't not be the resurrection and the life. And Lord, if we come before you this morning and believe in you, just like Lazarus, we are called out of the grave. And Lord, it's a belief, it's a moment of trusting in who you are, and we are saved for eternity. But Lord, it's also believing and living in you. It's bringing all that we are every single day to your feet and letting you go to work with it. Father, I don't know where we are in this room. I don't know what's dead. I don't know what needs resurrection power this morning. I don't know who is struggling in this room with a marriage that is struggling, or kids that are causing problems, or just life in general that we're feeling so bogged down by. But Lord, in this room, I feel it and I know it because I know it for myself. We need the resurrection and the life here now. Lord, we need to be marked just like Lazarus as the ones who were brought back to life. Which means everywhere we go, in our homes, in our jobs, on social media, everywhere we go, we can't help but reflect you because we've come face to face. We've seen for ourselves the resurrection and the life. Lord, this morning as we close this service in prayer, I just pray for all of us across the room. Whatever things are coming in our minds that are dead, Lord, I pray every morning, every day, we lay them at your feet and we live not as broken people anymore, but as resurrected, whole new people in you. That's what you want for us, Father. It's in your name that we pray. It's in your name that we worship. It's in your name that we follow you, Lord. Amen.